Our Advent journey so far sometimes has been an intense one, hasn't it? In my first two Advent sermons, we looked honestly at the ambiguity and even pain that sometimes attends the season, reminding ourselves that to leap too quickly to Christmas leaves very little room for you or me if we are not feeling jolly. If we don't feel like it's the most wonderful time of the year, if we find ourselves perhaps unaccountably sad. And then in our choir's incredible offering of Bach's Magnificat, we heard once again those intense, powerful, prophetic words that Mary sang when the angel told her that she was to give birth to the Son of God. Quote, "He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty." I suspect that you will not see those words anytime soon on a Hallmark Christmas special. But today, this last Sunday of Advent, this Christmas Sunday, we now can see more clearly in the ever-shortening distance that for which we have been waiting and preparing. And we're now ready, more ready, to embrace the coming of Christmas. But I still have one more question to ask this morning. Why sing? Why sing? And to answer that question, let's turn to those shepherds and the familiar story we heard Matt read this morning. Like you, I love the way the carol Angels We Have Heard on High focuses one of its verses on the shepherds. But at the same time, that verse has also always puzzled me. It, of course, goes like this: "Shepherds, why this jubilee? Why your joyous strains prolong? Say, what may the tidings be which inspire your heavenly song?" They did it better, but you get the point. Do you notice something, though? Just like in the game Jeopardy, where the answer must be in the form of a question, the verse of this hymn, this retelling of the shepherd's story, is also in the form of a question. Shepherds, why this jubilee? And yet there is a question that has to come even before that question. Because while the hymn so beautifully asks the shepherds why they are singing, we actually need to ask an even more basic question: why shepherds? What do I mean? Well, consider the very abrupt transition between two of the verses in this story. In verse 7 it says, "Mary gave birth to her firstborn son and laid him in a manger." And then immediately following, in verse 8, it says this: "In that region there were shepherds out in the fields, keeping watch over their flocks by night." That's rather an abrupt transition. The only thing connecting the two verses would appear to be geography in that region. But that's a pretty thin connection, isn't it? After all, there must have, in fact, been all kinds of people in that region doing their things that night. In other words, why do the angels go to the shepherds to announce this good news? What's the story trying to tell us by making these shepherds the very first persons in the world to hear of the birth of Jesus? After all, we could imagine the story very differently, couldn't we? Because if it is simply geographic proximity that is the connecting link here, there were indeed plenty of other people that were nearby that night. After all, the story could have gone this way. In that region, there were Roman soldiers on night sentry duty. Or the story could have said, in that region, the Bethlehem police had stopped for a cup of coffee at Denny's. But of course, the story doesn't go that way. No, the angel's announcement is made to a scraggly band of shepherds on an unnamed hillside in a very unlikely place. In one of the songs in the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, our question is asked this way, as the singer says to God, "Why'd you choose such a backward time and such a strange land? Indeed, why here? Why now? Why shepherds? Why shepherds?" Well, if mere geographic proximity isn't enough to answer that question, what does? Well, two things. First, the fact that they are shepherds is meant to remind us of something. It's meant to remind us of the whole history of God's gracious dealings with God's people. How so? Well, in the Old Testament, the most remembered shepherd, of course, is David. But before he was a king, he was a shepherd. One whose vocation was to make sure that the flocks didn't wander off to untimely deaths, didn't follow false hopes of that yummy-looking but poisonous plant, or didn't drink from waters that would make them sick. So, the announcement to those Bethlehem shepherds, rather than to the tax collectors or the soldiers or the rulers or whomever, this announcement to the shepherds was a dramatic sign that God intended to continue to keep faith with God's people. For now, this child Jesus, one who is from the very lineage of David, would be the one to share God's abiding grace, not just with the Jewish people now, but with all peoples. And he would do so as a shepherd himself, caring for us tenderly and leading us clearly, thereby showing us what God is like. So that's the first reason why shepherds. But secondly, and even more importantly, it is the words that the angels say that connect the birth of Jesus to those in that region, to those in Israel, to those all around the Mediterranean, to those ultimately all around the world, and down to this very morning in Colorado Springs. What were those words? Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. We all know that part of what hurts us sometimes is indeed our fear. It is fear that often isolates us. It is fear of someone different that sometimes makes us respond in ways that are less than our best. It is fear that can keep our vision and our empathy too narrow. It is fear that can keep us imprisoned. And those things harm us. This admonition and this comfort, do not be afraid, is in fact found over 100 times in the Bible. So you see, Luke's telling of the Christmas story proclaims to us that we can be healed of that which is harming us. Luke's story of how God acted on that night so long ago is first of all a story of healing and hope. God could have chosen so many things for the angels to say about Jesus, but the first thing that was to be said was, be not afraid. For when all is said and done, the reason that we can indeed not be afraid, the reason that it is possible that we can be healed of what is hurting us and holding us back, is that God has become human. God, therefore, knows firsthand what our lives, our wonderful, motley, messy, complex, tragic, joyous lives are like. God has lived as a human. That's what the incarnation, Emmanuel, God with us, means. And so all of that finally tells us then the answer to our original question. Shepherds, why this Jubilee as well? How? Well, the great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr said this, quote, "People do not achieve the greatest moral heights out of a sense of duty. Now, you may be able to compel them," he said, "to maintain certain minimum standards by stressing duty, but the highest moral and spiritual achievements depend not upon a push, but upon a pull." Not a push, but a pull. My friends, that in a nutshell is why the shepherds' jubilee. For what was made known to them that night is that the universe is not ultimately coercive, not ultimately threatening, not ultimately ruled by force and violence and hate, but by the persistent, gentle, persuasive love of God. Not the push of coercion and threat, but the pull of a vision of gentleness and hope. And after all, you and I know all too well, don't we, about coercion and the hurt and even the violence that inhabits the world, that affects our lives, that is too often indeed the push we didn't want and yet which shoved us along anyway. We know about the push, the coercion of disease and homelessness and hunger, the push of unfair people having too much power over life, of relationships that have become brittle because of the push of violent words or actions, the push of policemen assassinated, or of racial injustice, or children shot dead because of the fecklessness of adults, the push of an addiction whose power is coercive indeed, the push of mortality that forces each one of us inexorably into an increasing diminishment of choices that ends at death. Oh yeah, we know the push of life. We know the power of force. We know the ways of hatred and hurt. But friends, the good news this morning, the good news at which the shepherds leapt and shouted and sang is that it is not these pushes, real as they are, it is not the force and unfairness of life, real as they are, that are the ultimate, the final, the most real things. No. The shepherd's jubilee is because at the heart of reality is not push, but pull. You see, God through Christ is indeed pulling the whole world toward that stable there in Bethlehem. And it's our choice how we respond. For that stable shows us that God is indeed a pull, not a push, that God is unfailingly good, that nothing is beyond God's love, even on those days when there is too much push in our lives, even on those days when we sometimes despair that the push of violence and meanness in too many parts of this world is too strong, even on those days when we mourn and grieve the bitter push of disease that too often takes life in too untimely a way, even amidst all these things and more, it is indeed that stable in Bethlehem that houses the good news that finally it is about pull, not push. that finally the world is under the care of a God who loved us enough to become one of us, and that finally and always the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not, cannot, will not overcome it. That's why we sing.